Summary of Chapter 9, Performance Assessment for Healthcare Organizations. Original chapter by Peter Arthur Woodbridge and George Oscar Allen of Nebraska Western Iowa Healthcare System. Tracking healthcare performance is really difficult. The first half of this chapter talks about some of the rationale and reasons to track performance, and the second half talks about how difficult it is to actually do. The chapter starts by mentioning how performance measures, quote, motivate, illuminate, and communicate. It continues, performance measures motivate by enabling tangible goal setting and factual feedback, which in turn clarifies expectations, promotes accountability, and shapes behavior. Performance measures illuminate by establishing objectivity and consistency, leading to enhanced problem solving, modeling, decision-making, and progress tracking. Third, performance measures communicate by increasing the visibility of goal attainment and performance gaps, thereby focusing on organizational attention, understanding, and organizational alignment. And these three things, motivation, illumination, and communication, are part of the reason and rationale for setting performance measures. Some general advice the chapter gives is that goals should be specific, that commitment should be individual and not aggregate or too much team-based, that it is important for individuals to believe in the importance of the goal, and that they can believe in self-efficacy, meaning that they can attain the goal. Breaking a goal into smaller steps and tracking each step is useful. The chapter claims that performance is not affected by who sets the goal. Personally, and from John Doerr's work on OKRs, I don't agree with this and do think that individuals working to set their own goals does produce superior results. The book brings attention to the concern of performance measurement-driven organizational dysfunction. And there's two types of organizational dysfunction that performance measures can draw. The first type is people who don't believe in the performance measurements, and therefore they work to discredit the measurements and those who set them. The second are people who try to game the system, and they work very hard to achieve the measurements and goals set, but at the same time produce undesired counter results. And last, the chapter mentions that performance metrics shouldn't be compared in public settings when they rank individuals. Doing so leaves 50% of people below average, and therefore 50% of people walking away from the activity with less self-efficacy. And given the importance of self-efficacy in the ability to carry through future goals, it actually harms the organization as a whole. The book moves away from general concepts of goal setting to more specifics on how to assess performance. And it's tough to get the right balance in these performance measurements between having too many and too few, where too many makes it difficult to find the focus. Most Silicon Valley startups would suggest that fewer performance metrics are actually better overall for driving growth. The chapter also suggests that there's a difficulty in identifying how hard or how difficult a performance measurement should be. If they're too difficult, more people won't attain them, and again, this can affect group self-efficacy. And whenever performance measurements are introduced, it's important that they are first introduced as experimental phases until it's validated that it's actually the right indicator to be tracking, and only then tie it to a system's performance. The concept of balancing measures, as introduced previously, was emphasized, and the balance measures hope to curb unanticipated consequences that occur when people try to maximize one goal. There is brief discussion of a Donbedian framework, which admittedly was not very useful, so we'll just skim through it. It suggests three components: structure, process, and outcomes. In short, organizational structure influences process, and process in turn determines outcomes. Structure was defined broadly as the physical space, the support services such as electronic medical records, the equipment, human resources, and an example may be a clinical reminder for A1C. Process is the actual activities to provide care, and this example was the frequency of measuring an A1C, and outcomes was the proximal and distal outcomes measured. And there was close correlation between proximal and distal outcomes in that a proximal outcome may lead to distal outcomes. For instance, the proximal outcomes may be a A1C reduction, and the distal outcomes being improved life expectancy, like amputation frequency and blindness. Vertical and horizontal integration is discussed. Vertical is when departments connect up to organizational strategies, and this helps turn high-level goals and ideas into tangible work. Horizontal integration connects activities between departments with each other, and this works to break down silos. The Institute of Medicine in 2006 proposed 9 design principles for performance measures. The 9 are comprehensive, accurate and credible, longitudinal, supports multiple uses intrinsic to care, expresses the patient's voice, provides multiple perspectives, shared accountability, learning system, independent, and sustainable. Moving on to the part on healthcare performance measurements, it discusses that there are many different measurement systems in use, everything from inpatient to outpatient medicine, home care services, nursing home quality, medical equipment, reviewing mortality and morbidity, but there is little agreement on the preferred measurement system, and obviously this causes problems. A case study with the VA is used, showing that in the 1990s, the VA brought in capitated funding, electronic medical record systems, and the third part of their improvement was performance measurements. And this initially started with an external peer review program that would pull patients' charts at random to review them as part of their performance measurements. And this has since grown to now include over several hundred different measurements. And they then formed in 2005 an inpatient evaluation center to focus more on inpatient mortality and length of stay. The third section on the barriers to healthcare performance discusses 5. The first, it's difficult to create good performance measurements, and the reason for this is that they often derive from clinical guidelines. And the clinical guidelines themselves often have variable processes on how they're constructed. They may often not be evidence-based, and therefore the concern that clinical guidelines may not be well-rooted leads to further concern that the performance measurements which are based on these clinical guidelines may actually not be tracking things worth tracking. The second barrier is the difficulty of collecting performance measurement data. Even with the EHR, we aren't able to capture much performance measure data, and that's often because these types of metrics aren't part of the EHR generally. The third problem is that people love to create more performance measurements, and this means that the number of performance measures keeps growing and growing, and we lose focus on which are actually truly important. When organizations begin to achieve performance measurements, what we find is that the difference between sites performing on an individual measurement may actually not be significant. And therefore, when sites are rated as good or bad based on those which have the highest or lowest difference in performance measurements, this difference actually may not be significant and may be unfairly rating groups against each other. And the last is that other industries have moved from performance measures into performance measure aggregation, where you can end up with a composite score. But there's really no method established in healthcare to aggregate performance measurements. It's difficult because it's unclear how particular events, such as a catastrophic outcome such as death, should be weighted compared to other types of performance aggregates. And depending on how you aggregate the score, whether you use an all or none strategy, 70% standard, overall percentage, indicator average, patient average, you end up with a very different composite score result. And looking into the future, in the final part here in part 4, this book suggests that 2 systems may help improve performance measurement. First is NLP, or natural language processing, and the second is business intelligence. The hope the book mentions is that NLP will be able to use the unstructured data of the electronic health record to produce real-time data, which can then be fed in to create operational business intelligence, meaning that the actual reporting of performance metrics and measurements, rather than having a lag of days, weeks, or months, will be almost real-time, and therefore be able to influence and improve care. So to summarize, the book talks about how performance measurements can motivate, illuminate, and communicate. It discusses the importance of putting in balancing measures in order to counter the negative effects that performance measures can cause, and that ultimately one of the roles of performance measurements is to help integrate systems vertically and horizontally and improve care. But there are not insurmountable barriers to simply collecting the data and identifying what things should be studied.